Well, good evening, everybody. Nice to see you at our Manly Talks seminar tonight. My name's Candy Bingham. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the President of the Good for Manly Association, and also I'm the Deputy Mayor of the Northern Beaches Council. And I'm delighted to have with us tonight Stephen Coulter, who I will be introducing to you more formally shortly. Hello, Stephen.
Hi, Candy.
Good to see you.
Good to be here.
Tonight, before we get started, I'd first of all like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and pay my respects to elders past and present. So how we'll be running tonight is Stephen, I think, has about a 25-30 minute presentation for us. I've been fortunate to have a preview. It is excellent, and I'm sure you'll be absolutely intrigued with the things that he has to share with us tonight. So let me formally introduce Stephen to you. He's an innovator, influencer, and entrepreneur. Has over 30 years experience in financial services, online payments and telecommunications, and is passionate about mobility and sustainable transport. And I can certainly vouch for that. He's on the Urban Mobility Task Force for the Smart Cities Council of Australia and New Zealand, the convener of the Asia Pacific Micro Mobility Alliance, a member of the Industry Advisory Group on e-scooters for Transport of New South Wales, and a transport advisor for local politicians. And he's also working very closely with Good for Manly as well, and we're very grateful for that. So I'm delighted to formally introduce to you Stephen Coulter, who will be speaking to us tonight about reclaiming our streets, COVID's silver lining. Over to you, Stephen.
Good evening, everyone. Well, as Candy said, I'm going to talk about some of the transport trends we're seeing around the world, and in particular talk about the impact of COVID. Because while COVID has been a terrible thing around the world, it's actually enabled a lot of transport changes to occur that otherwise would have taken years and years, if not decades. What you're seeing on the slide here is a recent shot in Paris, a road that used to be a busy road for cars. And you can see what's happened in Paris. They've got rid of cars. They've allocated more space to bikes, electric scooters. They've kept buses there, but they've made Paris a place that's a lot more aligned with people than with vehicles. And this has happened throughout Paris. It's happening around the world in lots of different ways, which we're going to talk about tonight. So let's start a bit closer to home. And I'd like you to imagine a typical city street. And what you see, for most of us, it's a variation of a familiar scene. You'll see 2 lanes of automobile traffic, probably flanked by a row of densely parked cars on either side, and confined to the periphery in what's getting narrower and narrower on the sidewalks. There'll be the majority of human activity performed by pedestrians, joggers, tourists, commuters, parents, pet owners, and council workers. And these are the city streets that much of the world has come to know and accept over the past 100 years as urban living has progressively become defined by smog, combustion engines, and tens of millions of square metres of road space and car storage, also known as car parking. And it's time for that to end. And this is Sydney Road in Balgala, and you'll see the same scene all over Sydney and all over the world. The space is dominated by cars. The space for pedestrians and other activities is a really narrow space either side. And in particular in COVID times, it's really hard to social distance. And this photo was actually pre-COVID. And what you can see pre-COVID, it was not okay. Transport was in a mess and hadn't been solved and was actually getting worse. This data is from the 2016 census for the Northern Beaches, and it shows the vast majority of Northern Beaches commuters do it in cars. And those cars create 94% of all the pollution that's created by commuting transport from Northern Beaches citizens. It's a massive 57,000 tonnes of CO2 emissions a year just in the Northern Beaches. And the graph next to it is showing a Transport for New South Wales graph of public transport utilisation. This is again pre-COVID. The yellow line is where they predicted public transport patronage to be. The blue line, the dark one, is what was actually happening. So public transport was over capacity pre-COVID. Roads were over capacity, and we had a government that is fixated on roads and rail, and neither of them were working. and there's a transport phenomenon called induced demand. And whenever you build more roads, it actually makes traffic worse. It just encourages more people to drive. The same with car parks. So you've got to do things fundamentally different. And it's particularly crazy when you think that a huge amount of our journeys are short journeys. Pre-COVID, around 50% of the journeys, depending where you lived, were less than 10 kilometres. 20 to 30% are less than 5 kilometres. But they're still dominated by cars. And those cars typically don't have a passenger. The Northern Beaches commuters, only one car out of every 16 actually has a passenger. Mostly it's people driving alone. And what's really concerning in COVID, particularly in Australia and New South Wales, is that people are rushing back to cars. We don't want to go on public transit now, so the capacity is back there. But as Gladys Berejiklian said, public transit is a super spreader. That's one of the easiest places to become infected. If someone's on a bus, a train, a ferry, it's a really bad environment for surfaces and being close to people and getting infected. So people are actively avoiding public transit. They're going back to cars. This graph is from Apple. And Apple around the world is sharing this data city by city, showing how transport has changed from pre-COVID to COVID and post-COVID. And what you can see for Sydney, and this is up to date, is that driving is already 4% higher than it was pre-COVID, and it has been higher. Transit is down 50%, which is not surprising. Walking, it says, is down 38%. I think the Apple data isn't particularly accurate there because they're taking this off people using Apple Maps to find directions. And because a lot more of us are living and working from home, we're not actually using directions because we know where we're walking to. So I think you'd find walking would be probably at least back to its pre-COVID level. But we're still seeing in Sydney more than 2 million car trips a day of less than 2 kilometres. And most of those are driver only. So people are doing short journeys in their cars. And what's more, as I'm sorry, I've gone the wrong way there. And what's more, it's been dangerous. If you look at Transport for New South Wales road toll data from crashes, you've got to call them crashes now, they're not accidents. The road toll for people in cars and their passengers is down, and cars have become safer and roads have become safer for cars and their occupants, but more dangerous for everyone else. And in New South Wales year to date, the pedestrian road toll is up 40% over the same period in 2019. The death toll of women is up over 10%, and the death toll of children is up 57%. That's children under the age of 17. So local transport really needs to be safer. Most local journeys are short, but we've got local pathways that are busier. We've got more local walkers, but we've got far too many cars out locally, which are hazards to everybody else. We need to get the short journeys out of cars to other modes of transport. But Manly and the Northern Beaches isn't special in this regard. We've had the same problems happening in every city around Australia and just about every city around the world. Unfortunately, there are some countries and some cities that are far more progressive than Sydney's been so far. So there are some really good examples of solutions emerging around the world that I really hope we can take on board in Manly, the Northern Beaches, and Sydney more broadly. So I'm going to look at 5 examples of what's happening around the world and talk about how they could also apply in the Manly area itself. So the 5 things we're seeing around the world is road space being reallocated back to local community, changing that shift from dominating space with cars to bringing it back to getting more people into cities than vehicles. How can we encourage more COVID-safe, sustainable transport to make up for the cars we'd like to remove from the roads? Lower speed limits, which we've already seen happening in Manly, and how they contribute to better community and improve road safety. Have a look at what's called open streets, or trialling street closures to give, again, street space back to people and activities in community. And finally, we'll look at making local streets safer for children. So in terms of the first one of reallocating space from cars back to people and community, there's a really big trend that's been happening around the world called parklets. And this is where you take car parks in front of businesses and either allow those businesses to use that space for their own business, or you put in community facilities such as some of the seating you can see on the right-hand picture on this screen. And it's really important in COVID times because, as we know, the restaurant industry has really suffered, and Manly's been no exception to that. And that's because, one, they were closed for so long, and now they're reopening, but there's social distancing, so their capacity is down dramatically. So having parklets enables restaurants to have more customers and to abide by social distancing. And it actually creates a much more festive environment, having more people outside, particularly now when we're coming back into spring and summer. And it actually increases the turnover of local businesses. There's been a lot of research done around the world. And whenever you reallocate local parking spots to either bike lanes or to parklets, the turnover of those businesses goes up because people spend money, vehicles don't. You want more people at a local level if you want to help local businesses. And we think there are lots of opportunities for this to happen in Manly and also more broadly in the Northern Beaches. Here's a couple of photos of the end of the Corso and of Wentworth Street, which is currently being resurfaced. And both of those places are ideal to have parklets to support local businesses, or in Wentworth Street to have a bike lane down the left-hand side of the road as we're looking at it here. There's lots of public parking in Manly. We can afford to get rid of some of the street parking to get more people and activities back onto the streets. And likewise around the rest of the Northern Beaches, lots of strip shopping centres are well suited to repurposing a few car park spots to having more facilities for active transport and for the local businesses. We're also seeing around the world pop-up and permanent bike lanes happen a lot. And again, this is where you reallocate or move car parking to accommodate bikes, electric scooters, and it's also really important to separate pedestrians from other forms of transport. A lot of cities talk about having 3 lanes. You've got pedestrians on footpaths, you have bike lanes for bikes, and then you have the roads for cars. And cities are much safer if you can separate those 3 modes of transport. The photo you're seeing here is really what best practice is around the world. And best practice is like you see here, where the car parking, because it's a wide road, has been preserved, but the car parking has moved out to create a bike lane between the gutter and the cars. So the cars are effectively a protective barrier to make the cyclists feel safer. And you can see there's about another half-metre gap between the cars and the bike lane, so you don't have what's called car dooring happening. And that happens a lot where the cyclist is riding along in a narrow bike lane that's next to cars. The driver doesn't see the cyclist, they open the door and there's a crash. This happens all around the world, and this sort of solution stops that from happening. Around Manly, the Northern Beaches, we don't have great bike lanes, but we have huge amounts of cyclists, as you'll see, as we used to see at the wharf every day by all the bike parking. But the problem we have is that a lot of our bike paths aren't great. They're shared pathways with pedestrians, which are busier, or they don't actually connect. And the real key to bike lanes is to have them connect to the main transit hubs and the main destinations in an area. So you focus on the main connectors first and make them safe. The main barrier to people riding bikes more is not feeling safe. So having protected bike lanes, whether they're pop-up lanes or whether they're permanent, makes people feel a lot safer. Now, it's fortunate the New South Wales government is allocating some money for pop-up bike lanes, and I understand Northern Beaches Council has just secured some. So we'll start seeing some of these pop-up bike lanes happen in the local area in the next few months. The other thing we need to do is to encourage new forms of sustainable transport. And the reason we need to do that is if we're going to stop using cars for these short journeys, we need to give people alternative means to undertake those journeys. And what you can see here are 4 photos I've taken around Manly recently with some of the emerging forms of transport. And only one of them is actually a legally permitted form of transport, which is the cargo bike in the top left. Cargo bikes we're seeing more and more in Manly, and they're mostly families using them to move children around and get to and from school. So you'll see them a lot in school hours. But around the world, they're increasing in popularity by massive amounts. Lots of local businesses are starting to use them for local deliveries and to even to take rubbish to local tips and things like that. We're seeing local governments like Northern Beaches in the UK buy fleets of 200 or more, so the council workers can use them to do jobs between local depots and local businesses, and even make them available for local businesses to use, because every time you use a cargo bike, it's taking a truck or a van or a heavy vehicle off the road. They can use bike lanes, and they're far more practical than having heavy vehicles during the day. The other 3 vehicles you're seeing here are all legally allowed vehicles in Australia. The Australian government has really good laws around what's allowed to be imported and safety standards, and all of these other devices are allowed. And you're allowed to have them in your home, and if you go into JB Hi-Fi or Harvey Norman, they're selling them. But New South Wales is way behind here, and they haven't made them legal to use in public spaces. So it's actually illegal to ride them on a footpath or on a road, and the people you're seeing here could all be fined if the police chose to. But what you're actually finding is that the early adopters of these forms of transport are typically pretty sensible, and they're very environmentally focused because they're using these forms of transport, and they've actually paid $1,000 or more in some cases to have them. And around the Northern Beaches, there's already hundreds, if not thousands of these that you'll see. And we've got things like bottom left outside the stain is an electric skateboard. And these are, electric skateboards that allow people to go longer distances with backpacks or with something to get to a ferry or to do a local journey. Top right, you can see a surfer wearing a helmet on what's called a unicycle or an electric uni wheel, standing with his foot either side, balancing on it with a surfboard under each arm. Try doing that on a bike or a scooter. And down the bottom, you can see a couple of people riding electric scooters to Manly Wharf, and that may even be me and my wife. But they're really practical forms of transport, particularly for short journeys up to 2.5 or 5 kilometres, depending on the sort of device you have. And when we look around Manly in the Northern Beaches, our area is ideal for this. Those circles all have a 2.5 kilometre diameter. So pretty much 90 to 95% of the local Manly population live within 2.5 kilometres of a beeline or a ferry stop or a local shopping centre. So there are ways to get to them without using a car that's very close. 2.5 kilometres on a scooter you can do in 10 minutes. So it's not a time difference either. And the beauty of scooters and these devices are that you ride direct to your destination. You don't need to find parking. And it's the same up and down the Northern Beaches. That rectangle has got a plumb bob down the middle that's 2.5 kilometres to either side. So most of the Northern Beaches population live within a short distance of the major hubs they need to get to. And we don't need to use cars as often as we do. The next thing we're seeing is speed limits coming down. And it happened recently in Manly, where Manly was the first area of New South Wales to reduce speed limits to 30 kilometres an hour in the CBD area, which was a really visionary thing to do. And I know a lot of drivers complained about at the time and felt it was an attack on drivers. But this is actually a global trend that's been happening for some years, and we're catching up with it here now. It's great for local streets and for busy areas because typically the traffic speed wasn't much more than that, except in really quiet times. It's much better for community and livability, and it's much safer. If you look at the accidents at lower speed, there's less likely to be bad injuries, and the accidents are less likely to occur if traffic is moving slower. It also allows roads to be narrower and more space given back to pedestrians and the community. And in most cases, this is on relatively short streets. and the time change in a journey is not going to be significant. If we have a look at the photo I'm showing here also is a recent one last week in Washington, DC in the US. They've just dropped their speed limit to 20 miles an hour, which is about 30 kilometres. And that's not just for DC, not just for the main part of the city, it's all of the District of Columbia now has a speed limit of 20 miles an hour as the default. So you're going to see that speed limit of 30 become more widespread in more places in the northern beaches and around Sydney and Australia. From a safety perspective, this graph is getting a lot of coverage around the world because it shows the likelihood of someone being killed depending on the speed that the car or the vehicle is travelling. And what you can see up here is at 60 kilometres an hour on the bottom axis, if you go up to where the line is, there's a 100% chance of the person dying. If you're hit by a car travelling at 60, you're as good as dead. But as speed drops down, you get to 50 and that's down to 85%. But then after you get below 50, the chances of survival go up dramatically. And so if a car is driving at 40 kilometres an hour, there's a 25% chance that someone will get killed if they get hit by it. But once you get to this magic number of 30, it's under 10%. I think it's about 7.5% is the likelihood of death in that situation. So getting speed limits on these small local roads or busy areas where you've got more pedestrians down to 30 is a really sensible thing to do. And it typically has very little impact on journey time. We're seeing speed limits drop generally too, not just, we're going to still have our 110s on freeways, but if you look at local areas, there's lots of opportunity to make changes that make community spaces more livable and safer. And as far as I'm aware, this hasn't been proposed anywhere, and I know some people probably don't want it. But if you look at somewhere like Sydney Road, when people come up Spit Hill and they're turning off the Burnt Creek onto Sydney Road to come to Manly, that strip from Seaforth to Manly has got 8 sets of traffic lights. It's got 3 strip shopping centres. It's got Sydney buses stopping and starting the whole time. There are lots of schools and childcare facilities along that strip. So it's very rare, if ever, you're going to have an uninterrupted drive from the top of Spit Hill down into Manly. And when you get to Manly, the speed limit's 30. So you don't want to be driving at 60 and have a really radical speed change. So I think it could actually make a lot of sense if we drop the speed limit right along Sydney Road to 40 kilometres an hour. You've already got school zones where it's that speed for 3 hours a day anyway. And it would, worst case, it would create a 90-second delay. If you previously could drive that stretch at 60 and now you drive it at 40, it's 90 seconds out of your life that's the difference. And it would rarely be that. But we think that that sort of thing is going to happen. It's not going to happen on the major roads, the thoroughfares, but on when you're coming into busy areas where there's shops, there's schools, you're coming into an area like Manly, it makes a lot more sense to calm the traffic speed along the way into those destination points too. The next area that's happening a lot around the world is what's called open streets. And open streets are where you close streets off to cars on a temporary basis. What you're seeing on the left here is we were in Warsaw in Poland last September. Every weekend in Warsaw, this is the center of the old town, the streets are closed to cars on Saturdays and Sundays. It didn't start that way. It started with being just one day at a weekend, and they found that the community enjoyed it. It had no major impact outside of the area. There's still roads with cars not too far from where this video was shot. But it brings people back to the heart of the city and creates a much better environment. So open streets is all about testing things, and that's what we've got to do in COVID, where we're going through radical change. It's the perfect time to test something. And if it doesn't work, fair enough, we go back to the way it was. But hopefully from testing things like open streets and parklets and pop-up bike lanes, we'll find some of them work really well. And we won't end up going back to what we had before. We'll go back to a better normal from the lessons that we can learn through COVID and testing transport in particular. It's good to hear that Manly, again, has got some money to test this. And I think Tanya Park is going to be the first area in the region. And once a month for the next few months, there's going to be, I think, one day at a weekend where the Tanya Park roadway is shut off to allow kids and others to ride bikes and scooters and skateboards around the perimeter of Tanya Park. And there are 3 other destinations on the northern beaches that will also be participating in that over the next few months. So it's a really good start. I'd like to see it happen more broadly and really get some testing happening. I think in Manly itself, with so many more people walking around because they're living and working from home and coming back into summer and spring soon with more tourists coming in, areas like the ocean front between Wentworth Street and Raglan Street could easily be open streets without having a major impact on traffic. The Corso doesn't need to have parts of Darley Road. So I think without making permanent change, there's great opportunity to test some of these things. It might just be Sundays to begin with, and we see if it works and what impact it has. But if we can learn from it, fantastic. We'll end up with a better community, a better space after COVID if we can learn through the experience. The last area I'm going to talk about is making streets safer for children. And you saw earlier that the road toll for children was already up by 57% this year compared to the same time last year. And there's a few things that can happen here. Firstly, there's a big movement called Play Streets. So I've got the URL of the website up there. So afterwards you can look it up if you like. They've got lots of great resources. And this has to be community driven. Play Streets is again about closing roads temporarily. It might be for a few hours on a Saturday or a Sunday to encourage children to play back on the streets, to encourage neighbours to get together on the streets. It's already been tested around the world in many places, and Waverley Council across the harbour is finding great success with it, both from kids and from neighbours getting together. But it has to be community-led. Councils aren't going to do this without streets requesting it. And if you think about the area we live in, there's probably 30% or more of our streets which are local residential streets with kids where this could happen, and get kids playing back on the streets like we all used to when we were kids. So have a look again at that website. There are resources there. We need to agitate and encourage councils to allow it. What councils need to do is to say that we will permit play streets to occur and provide the support for local residents who want it to do it in their streets, just as Christmas parties happen in December once a year, but this is making it more formal, and again, allowing it to happen any time of the year and using COVID as a reason to test it, where more kids are at home, give them a chance to play safely in the streets. The last area with children is making it safer getting to and from school, and also making it healthier. If we look around the area, we've got a huge amount of schools, and if you measure the distance between those dots, you'll find that it's typically no more than 2 or 3 kilometres at most. So most children live within, or 50% of children live within 1 kilometre of the public school they go to, and most live within 2 kilometres. But look what's happened over the last 50 years. In the 1970s, 75% of children walked or rode a bike or scooter to school. Now that's down to 25%. Only 1 in 4 children walk or ride or scooter to school. So 75% of children have got parents getting a car out, driving 1 or 2 kilometres, creating traffic congestion. 25% of peak hour traffic is parents driving to school in Sydney. And if you could take that traffic off the road, because it doesn't need to be there, it's going to make it much better for everyone. It's also going to make it safer. When we walk around near and see our local schools in the morning or around 3 o'clock, the traffic is horrendous. There are traffic jams in the streets, and I'm sure some of the injuries to children that have increased this year are happening around school time, because there's so many cars moving in every direction, you wouldn't know what's going on. So we've got to get kids walking to school with their parents, doing walking school buses if that's required. If they live close to a school, let them walk, let them take a bike, ride a bike or a scooter. They're good places to reduce speed limits. I think school zones still 40. I can see that coming down to 30 based on the research that's happening around the world. But if we make the local speed limits of streets near schools slower, it makes it far safer for kids to both walk or ride to school. So finally, that's the fifth and final one. And the theme, I guess, I've been going through is we've got to make the most of COVID in terms of testing things that are going to make us safer through COVID with social distancing and having healthy forms of sustainable transport. And Winston Churchill once said, "You never let a good crisis go to waste." This really, from a transport perspective, is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to test things while the world is different and see what works, see what doesn't. Not everything will work, but it's a chance to learn and to learn how we can make our local area and the world a much better place through getting people out of cars and putting incentives in place to use other forms of transport. The changes we're seeing overseas, in particular, being made overnight. Some cities have been putting in as much as 20 kilometres of pop-up bike lanes in one night. I think we've had a bit of COVID complacency in Australia because it's been well managed as a disease, but that's meant governments haven't taken the radical actions some of the governments in Europe and America have done. And I think it's time we need to do that right now in the Northern Beaches and in New South Wales, because if we get through COVID without testing these opportunities, the opportunities are going to be lost. So I've got a couple of email addresses up there of people you can send emails to influence, and Candy will send out some of the links from this presentation afterwards tomorrow. But we think from a transport perspective, this is actually an exciting time and there's a lot of good that can come out of it. And I'd be really keen to hear your thoughts and hear your questions. So thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Stephen. Well, I must say the questions are adding up here, so which is good to see. And thank you for those who have already put your questions forward. Clearly, many have found your presentation, Stephen, very interesting, but also extremely thought-provoking. And a lot of issues, I guess, relate to a number of people have brought back the issue of it's all very well to slow down the traffic, particularly in areas like Sydney Road, for example, but won't that just encourage rat runs elsewhere in the area? And I have a number of questions, particularly from people who live in Lauderdale Avenue, Fairlight, Queenscliff, who are saying one of the challenges is all the focus has been put on Manly, and all that does is just make it harder for those who live in the areas where people are coming to Manly and using their local streets and speeding and so on. Have you got any thoughts on how we can manage this, particularly from a driver's point of view?
Yeah, look, we live on the corner of White Street / Lauderdale Avenue, so we see the rat run, and sometimes in the mornings it can take 5 minutes to get out of our street. There's so much traffic coming up and down. So I think governments need to look at those sorts of things too. And these lower speed limits need to be applied on streets like Lauderdale and White Street and your Balgala roads and the other places as well, and up and down the peninsula. It's not a magic wand where you change the speed limit in one spot and it's not going to have an impact elsewhere. It clearly is. So what you're seeing in Europe, and I guess when I mentioned the District of Columbia last week in the US, the entire area has a 30-kilometre speed limit. So there's no incentive to go on and find a rat run where the speed limit is just as slow, if not slower. So I think it has to be a holistic approach, but right now it's about testing and understanding if those rat runs come up, what do you do to discourage them? And it might be along Lauderdale Avenue that you actually have a lower speed limit as well in some of those other areas. A lot of cities will put traffic calming measures into roads that through street architecture that naturally limit the speed as well and discourage people from zooming up a Lauderdale Avenue or a White Street.
I must say, as a councillor, I'm getting, and I'm sure this will interest everybody, just lately I seem to be getting more and more complaints about speeding and so on in our area. So I've certainly been talking to the council about what can be done about that. Okay, I've got another question here. There's some really good questions, actually. Thank you, everybody. What about the safety of pedestrians with electric scooters and skateboards? As a pedestrian, regular skateboards often seem dangerous to walkers.
Yeah, I think that goes back to clearly defining where they can be used, and I think having good enforcement. The best practice is clearly to have footpaths that are only for pedestrians and bike lanes that are for bikes and scooters and roads that are only for cars, but that doesn't happen overnight. What we've seen around Manly is we've got shared pathways, which I think is probably where the challenges can be, because that's where you do have bikes and scooters mixing with pedestrians. But the facts actually don't go to prove that there are a lot of accidents between pedestrians and cyclists or pedestrians and skateboards. The accidents with pedestrians and cyclists and skateboards more often than not are a car not crashing into each other. 80% of bike and electric scooter accidents don't involve anyone else. They're simply the rider having an accident by themselves. And all the serious accidents typically involve cars. Zippity, our business, our main focus is on insurance for electric bikes, electric scooters around the world. So we've got access to a lot of data, and there's a lot of erroneous emotive information being spread. The facts, you wouldn't insure these activities if they were as dangerous as people are making out. So the challenge, cars are really the fundamental problem. There's too many, and roads are being made faster, straighter, wider. Corners are becoming rounded. All of these things allow cars to go faster and put everybody else at greater risk.
Well, so I think the other thing that I'm certainly noticing, and you raised this, is we really do need to separate. We need to separate the pedestrians from the cyclists from the cars. And of course, the challenge that we have in Sydney and on the northern beaches is our roads are very narrow. Our footpaths are very narrow. So that's another issue that needs to be looked at. And I think your parklets was an interesting idea too. So there's lots of things that we can do. I've got another question here. Actually, I've got quite a few questions here. So what do you suggest for parents with young children, such as toddlers, to travel and shop around the northern beaches? Ubers doesn't have child seats and the shuttle bus service doesn't accommodate prams. Could you suggest a vehicle-free option? Now, there's a challenge for you.
Yeah, and look, we're not saying don't have a car, and we still have one car and use that when we have to. And there are times you do actually need a car if you're getting kids to a further destination, or if you're doing shopping with kids and things like that. But certainly what we're seeing around the world is cargo bikes. A lot of for families are fantastic, and there's an increasing array of designs of them catering for all sorts of needs. They're clearly a lot cheaper than a second car. And a lot of the research we're seeing around the world is families have gone back to one car and replaced it with a cargo bike and using that for their local journeys of short distances. They still have a car when they need to go further. But cargo bikes are a great example of where there are better vehicles that are actually fun too. Kids love them.
Oh, that's a great idea.
And they're out in the fresh air, they're COVID safe.
Well, the other thing I might do too is I'm surprised that you can't take prams on the hop, skip and jump bus. So I'll follow that up too and see if that what can be organised there, because that's an obvious one, isn't it? Okay. Here's another comment sort of supporting that. Yes, as a pedestrian, I'm staying out of the skateboarder's way. Defensive walking, so to speak, needs separation. So I think we all agree on that one.
Yeah.
Another one here. Have you considered the demographics of areas such as Manly when considering major changes to the traffic movement?
Well, Manly's got, I guess, quite a mixed demographic. It was getting older, but the last 10, 20 years, the families really come back. So you've actually got this structure where you've got a lot of young people, young singles still live here because of the lifestyle. You've actually got a lot of families, which you can see by the number of schools and the growth in the students at the schools that are happening. All the local schools have grown significantly in the last 10 years. But you also still have an elderly population as well. So we've got a mix across all the major demographics, and transport needs to cater for all of those.
Okay, well, that's fair too. Here's another comment. Thank you, Stephen. Very inspiring. Hope you were sending this presentation to the Northern Beaches Council too. Well, I might say that I've actually arranged for Stephen and I to meet with the relevant staff of the Northern Beaches next week. And in addition to the things that Stephen's talked about tonight, there's lots of other suggestions that we're discussing about sensible bike lanes. Stephen, you might want to talk about your idea in relation to going from Seaforth to Manly Hospital, for example. So we're not just talking about Manly initiatives.
Yeah, well, if you're looking at connecting the major areas, French's Forest now, particularly with the hospital now, it's a much busy area. We did the Bantry Bay Walk last week, and alongside Wakehurst Parkway, 20 metres off the highway, is a fire trail for most of that journey that then connects up with some minor roads at Ararat Reserve near the Swiss or the Austrian Club up there. So something like that as a council project to make that fire trail into, which is already, bikes are already allowed on it, but make it a better service. There's lots of mud. It needs a bit of work done on it, but that would be a far quicker and cheaper alternative to have a bike path from Seaforth to French's Forest than trying to build a bike path on Wakehurst Parkway itself, which is already narrow, and to widen that would be, you know, a very expensive project compared to putting some bitumen or making a better surface on a fire trail that gives better access to the fire trucks when they're required, but also provides utility that anybody riding from Seaforth to French's Forest could do it safely without any cars at all.
Mm. And that's really the key, I think, separating, again, as we keep saying, separating the cyclists from the cars. Here's another one. Great presentation, Stephen. How do we address political resistance to change? Clover Moor is getting negative press from new pop-up bike lanes in southern Sydney, increasing traffic congestion, with photos of cars queued behind garbage trucks in single-lane streets. Oh, yes. How can planning anticipate practical pitfalls?
Well, I think you ultimately have to, planning has been very car-centric and still predominantly is. So I think the bike lanes that Clover Moor has put in and that Transport for New South Wales have put in another 10 kilometres in the last 3 months are actually getting a lot of praise from a lot of people. And people that were previously opposed to Clover's bike lanes are now saying they're amazed they've changed their tune when they're seeing how well they're being used. Now, I guess with the garbage trucks getting in the way of cars, well, that's an issue around what the timing is of those garbage trucks. But it's also an issue that some of those people in those cars are going to be doing very short journeys, and they're not in the traffic, they are the traffic. So whenever you're not stuck in traffic, you are the traffic, and they've got to look at their behaviour and do they need to be using their cars for short journeys as often as they do, because if you could remove the short journey cars, you're going to have a much better flow of transport and a much better flow of people. The other big trend in planning that I don't think has really hit New South Wales, I'm not really a fan of Transport for New South Wales right now. I think they've been quite slow and regressive. But around the world, a lot of governments now look at how many people you can move an hour, not how many vehicles you can move an hour. Yeah. And I think in a lot of Australia, the focus is still on how many vehicles can we move rather than how many people. And I think within Transport for New South Wales, the people in there get bonuses. Their bonuses are largely based on the average speed of cars on road. So they're incented to help cars move, not people move. You need to get away from the culture of moving vehicles and focus on moving people to get to a better solution.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We're moving on to a different angle here, which is good. So thanks, Stephen. Let's talk about health. The cost of obesity on the nation is in the billions. Let's focus on making cars less convenient and make active transport the most convenient option for Manly. Well, there's an interesting one.
Yeah, absolutely. We support that totally. And starting with parents getting their kids to school, let's get the needle back to 75% using active transport to school. And from a transport perspective, as it does get back to being safer, we think that Transport for New South Wales should be doing things like giving a transfer benefit to people catching a ferry or a bus who get to the ferry or bus stop on a bike or a scooter or even walk. Right now, if you catch a Transport for New South Wales bus to a ferry stop, you get a $2 discount off the ferry fare. But if you've forked out your own good money to buy a bike or a scooter or your own effort to walk there, you don't get any benefit. So governments need to think that all transport now is public transport. And if they really want to get changes in how that occurs, they need to give the same incentives to people using their own forms of transport that are saving the government from building infrastructure and buying more buses, and encourage them that way as well.
Okay, I think this is probably, I'm just checking. Oh no, this is the second last. Why encourage electric scooters, skateboards over walking from a health perspective?
Well, I think it's not so much from a health perspective. It's interesting with electric bikes around the world. They're finding people that ride them get as much exercise as they previously did from non-electric bikes. And the reason for that is that people ride them further and do longer journeys, and they're still pedaling some of the time. And that also shows that it's taking more cars off the road, because if you've got an electric vehicle that can get up a hill or go further, you're more likely to do that. And if you look at, say, electric scooters and where they're operating in Australia, in Brisbane, Adelaide, Darwin, and Canberra, shortly Canberra, they're finding that a lot of them, walking and cycling are not the most disrupted journeys. They're finding 40% of the use of electric scooters is actually people using them instead of a car for the short journeys, which is what's intended. They're also finding that people using them will do journeys that they perceive to be too far for walking. So it's actually helping businesses that are that little bit further away from the main spots, because people will ride further to go to a restaurant or to spend money at a local shop. And Darwin's had a really good experience with this through COVID, where a lot of the entertainment areas have done really well because electric scooters have allowed people to go further than they otherwise would to support local businesses.
Very good. I think we might finish on this last one because I think it's quite relevant, really. These are great ideas, but I'm worried about the backlash from the motorists. For example, taking away parking from cars. How should there be more effort to include our car drivers to get the community support for these solutions?
Well, I think a lot of the car drivers also at times cyclists and pedestrians, like we all are. So I think too much of this is seen as an attack on cars. It needs to be more about the overall education of communities and how to create better communities, more livable communities. And particularly right now, where a lot more people are working from home, so there's a lot more local and shorter journeys. And when COVID's over, that's not going to change dramatically, because lots of big companies are now deciding that it's actually worked for them. They don't need all their staff going back into their offices. And with social distancing, that will also be hard. So I think in the future, you're going to see probably between 30 and 50% of the people who have had to work from home now continue to work from home. So they're not going to have the same need to actually use a car. And as a driver, they'll have more opportunity to walk or ride a bike or ride a scooter and enjoy the fresh air and get some exercise.
Well, I must say that you really have lived up to the brief, reclaiming our streets COVID silver lining. Lots of really tremendous thought-provoking ideas there. I think a number of things that have come out of this that as a community we need to consider. But one of the things that's come out loud and clear too, it has to be an overall plan. We need to consider the consequences of, if we do something in one area, how is that going to affect another area? So I think thank you for those comments and questions in relation to that. Clearly for me, I think what's come out is the separation. We really do need to find ways to separate more effectively, the cyclists from the pedestrians, from the people on scooters and so on. And that's a consideration the council needs to take on board. And as I mentioned, I'm very excited. The council is working very hard on a lot of these initiatives. I think as a community, we can see the potential of it. We just want to make sure that it's done properly. So using a trial is a really good way to do it. And this COVID times is providing us with that. And we have been able to get some funding. So through Good for Manly, we'll certainly keep you informed as to ideas as they come through. As Stephen said, there will be a trial coming up shortly at Tanya Park. It'll only be for a couple of hours, maybe on a Sunday morning. But these ideas are worth trialling, and let's see how popular they are. So Stephen, thank you again on behalf of Good for Manly and all those who have been listening to the presentation tonight. Just want to mention to you all as well, we will be sending you a survey tomorrow. Please take a moment just to fill in and give us your feedback. How did you find the presentation? Did you find it of interest? Any other topics that you might want us to cover for you? And if you're not receiving our newsletter, it would be a good opportunity just to give us your details. We're happy to send you our monthly newsletter, which keeps you up to date on all the things that are happening in Manly and well, Manly Ward effectively, and also what the council's doing. This has been recorded, so we'll be putting it up on YouTube. So if you'd like to share it with colleagues, then we'll send you that link as well via the newsletter. So I think that's all we need to say, other than to thank the Good for Manly team who worked so hard to put this together. Thank you again, Stephen. You are amazing, and your knowledge is tremendous, and it really has been a very, very interesting webinar tonight.
Cool. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. So good night, everybody, and we'll look forward to seeing you around Manly and Manly Ward in the future. Good night.